we're just going to give it a little bit of time for people to join. So I think we'll make a start when people can be joining. Okay, so hi everybody, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. My name's Steve Highwood. I'm one of the directors responsible for our construction consultancy services. I've been working in the building, in and around the building control industry for the last 30 years. And the introduction of the Building Safety Regulator, the new processes and procedures, are certainly some of the biggest changes we've seen. Every day I'm speaking to clients, contractors and architects, and I'm not convinced the industry is ready for the new regime. So over the next 4 days, we'll be providing daily webinars to provide you, our clients, more information and the opportunity to raise questions and prepare for the changes. Today, we'll be discussing the transitional arrangements for both new high-rise buildings, flats, student accommodation and hospitals for the current regime. Tomorrow, we'll provide a detailed review of the building safety regime for new relevant buildings, highlighting the process journey through the gateways and what is expected from all involved in the new process. Thursday, a detailed review on the changes to the processes for the building control applications for works outside of the high-risk regime works. I think this will probably surprise quite a few for people that haven't looked at the changes in detail and how it impacts the rest of the industry. And then Friday, we're going to move away from our traditional 45-minute presentation to a Q&A panel where Andy and myself will be joined by a couple of colleagues. So any questions that we have through this session, we'll pick up on Friday if we don't have time today. So as a quick introduction to Bureau Veritas, we're a global testing, inspection, certification organisation, over 84,000 staff in 140 countries. Here in the UK, we've got our construction consultancy team. Core services include fire engineering, building control, CDM, acoustics, structural inspections, just to name a few. In addition, we've got QA/QC services for large infrastructure projects. These services cover large nuclear projects, offshore wind farms, defence and manufacturing construction projects. The wider UK services include sustainability services, statutory mechanical and electrical inspection services, certification for all your ISO requirements, and cybersecurity via our global business known as Secura. So moving on to the presentation. So before we begin, just run through some housekeeping. Andy will be presenting for about 45 minutes, allowing 10-15 minutes for Q&A at the end. The session will be recorded and the recording will be shared with you after the session. If you do have any questions, then just drop them in the chat box at the bottom of the screen and we'll answer as many as we can at the end. As mentioned, we'll pick up any others on Friday's Q&A panel. All attendees will be on mute throughout the session to avoid any disruptions. So today, as always, Andy will be our speaker. He's a technical director within our building control business. Andy's got many years of experience in the building control world and worked on many major developments. He works closely with my colleagues, Chris Jones, Alan Adair and Jamie Jones in preparing our technical teams for the new changes and providing much of our thought leadership. So on that note, I'll hand over to you, Andy, and pick up with you with questions at the end. Many thanks.
Many thanks, Steve, and welcome everybody. This is an interesting challenge that's coming up very quickly, I have to say. I'm not sure that everyone thought it was going to happen so quick, but it has. And whilst a lot of the guidance is still not yet available, there is enough to get it going, as they say. So, as Steve has said, we're doing a series of webinars. Today, I'm going to cover the transitional arrangements, which is key for projects which are up and running and indeed projects which are about to start. The Building Safety Regulator gateway process is what I'm going to cover off tomorrow. And then the process for the other types of buildings, which has tightened considerably, will be dealt with on Thursday. And then we'll have a question and an answer panel. And you can throw pies as if you like. So that's the plan for the week, which Steve has outlined nicely. And I'm going to talk about what the significant changes are. These are my opinions. So that's what it is. It's I'm not going to bore you with Regulation X and Regulation Y. I think we need to get to the practical aspects. That's what I'm always about making sure we understand what the practical arrangements are. So the building control profession is now to be registered, which is a big stepping stone for all those in the building regulation departments, whether you're in local authority or whether you're approved inspector. The HSE is now called the Building Safety Regulator, and it's the building control body for higher risk buildings, where they will use a multidisciplinary team approach. Now, they don't actually undertake the building control themselves. They will sub it out as opposed to either a approved inspector on a framework agreement, or they'll use the local authority. So they will use them as their support team. They'll also use the fire officer and also any specialists that they deem necessary. They will also inboard, so they can get that multidisciplinary team approach to making sure that the process for the higher rise buildings are succinct and stricter, and indeed make sure we get safe buildings. One of the consequences of that is the choice of appointment of building control for high-rise buildings is now removed. So you can't choose an approved inspector. You don't have choice. The HSE are the overall body, and they will choose their subcontractor to work on your scheme. And the gateway process that I described earlier for the higher, it's now called higher risk buildings, will be covered in webinar 2, and we'll look at for all the other building control aspects in webinar 3. And today I'm going to concentrate on the transitional arrangements, which are very key for a lot of developers going through this challenging time. So the aim for the Building Safety Act was to make sure that we had competent persons working on projects, and that included building control. So we need to, as an industry, take that on board. And in fact, the CABE, who are one of our professional bodies, has become registered in making sure we go through an assessment and registration process as individuals. And they issued their guidance and their application forms for stage 1 only earlier this week. So that's how close we are to the deadlines of October and April next year. So we've now had that. So we'll have to gear up, and we have to make sure as individual building inspectors that we are competent enough to do the type of work that we are purporting to review and to seek to make sure it's safe. So that is the aim of the government. They've made this almost like a first stab. I mean, I know architects are registered, but this is the first time building control are officially registered and people in it are registered. So this is really the way forward. And I suspect that many other professions will have to take that stance, such as fire engineers and structural engineers who are already halfway down the road with their chartered status. But we now have to do this ourselves as building control. So 2 parts to this. The companies themselves will be known as RBCAs, yeah. So they'll be the registered building control approvers. Effectively, that's a name change for AIs, but it does include local authorities. Okay, so collectively, we all have to make sure that we are duty bound by the rules and the operational standards set by the regulator, because they have the overall responsibility for building control, not just for high rise, but for all other buildings. So the Building Safety Regulator, the HSE, will set the standards. They will set the operational rules. that we all have to work to, either as a RBCA, which is an approver, or a local authority. And alongside that, registered building control approvers and building control authorities must obtain and consider the advice of registered individual building inspectors. So it all comes down to the individual making sure that they are individually registered before carrying out certain building control functions. Those building control functions are such as plan assessments and site inspections, issuing of certain notices, formal notifications such as initial notices, plan certificates, and indeed the completion certificate, which is all very key in the overall process. So effectively the government have put a regime in that makes sure that all inspectors, whether you are working in local government or whether you are working in the private industry, must be individually registered to undertake those certain functions, which I say is plan checking and site inspections and doing all these notifications. Okay, that's the big change for building control. We have to get to that point where we are registered. And if you don't become registered, then there are certain aspects that we'll touch on later. Most people will be, I guess, moving towards that. So the register actually opens on the 1st of October 23. Well, as I say, we've started that process with the CABE, who are one of the companies that or professional bodies that are operating that. There are equivalents in the local authority field, which is more of an exam-based issue. But the register opens in October, and we must be in place for this new building control system by April 24. Okay, so very key for when you are selecting or asking building control the pertinent questions. One of them must be, are you becoming a new BCRA, and do you have the individuals that can deal with my project? Very key questions. So the issue that we have means that we have to be part of a company. So Bureau Veritas are committed to doing that. We are certainly going to be registered, and we're going to start that registration process as soon as the HSC allow us to do so. As I say, lots of our individual surveyors are already filling in the forms to become individual inspectors, but there'll be different classifications. Okay, so there'll be a class, which is effectively a trainee, a class 2, a class 3, and there'll be likely to be more divisions, and we're just waiting for some clarification on the divisions. It's likely to be domestic and non-domestic. There'll be a class 3, which is qualified and experienced building control surveyors that can work on relevant high-rise buildings. And I use the term relevant high-rise being residential and those type of buildings. And then class 4 will be managers who also are class 2 and class 3 surveyors, and also registered themselves. So they'll be a registered inspector, either class 3 or class 2 or 3, and then they'll be supervising. So again, there's another ratchet up for that, for those kind of people. Okay, so that is the overall scheme of events for building control. This is from the specification that we had recently from the CABE. There you go. It talks about class 2 being a registered building inspector, inspecting standard forms of residential and non-residential building work up to 18 meters. We are expecting the HSE to clarify a little bit more on this, but effectively that's most of the building regulation work up to 18 meters, 6-7 stories. Class 3, again, can be standard and non-standing building work. So you've got the likes of big offices, etc., would be a class 3. It's not just higher risk buildings. Okay, so you'd expect to have the relevant experience. Okay, and includes all types of building work included in class 2. So it's a coverall. So you should be able to be well experienced and fully qualified to be a Class 3 specialist. We'd expect to see RICS or CABE or MICIOB as part of those base qualifications, but then years of experience, I think, is really crucial for that kind of work. Also, then we got the Class 4, which is the technical managers who oversee and manage technical teams. Most of those will have had years and years of experience and will have built up that over, as I say, with the mentoring of inspectors and specialist inspections for the higher risk buildings, whether they are high-rise flats or whether they are large office blocks or assembly buildings or whatever. So that's the Class 4. Okay, so those are the people that are expected to be reviewing your building control submissions. So it can't be nobody, it has to be somebody, and it has to be somebody who is technically adept at dealing with your building control application. That's very clear from the government stance. Okay, so Building Safety Act. Where does it apply? So we know we've got to have building inspectors who are properly qualified and are able to deal with your work. But there's two distinct, in my little mind, groups. One is the high-rise schemes, which are subject to a more stringent regime, the gateway process. And then all the other schemes, which are non-high-rise. Again, different parts of this week, we will talk in depth. But those are the two main distinct groups. What do we need to do is to make sure we understand what is a high-rise scheme and what is in the high-rise definition. So it means residential schemes with 2 or more flats. So a single flat on top of a tower is not a high-rise building under the definition. It needs to be 2 or more flats. It needs to be student accommodation, hospitals, all with a habitable floor over 18 meters from the lowest floor level, or 7 stories. This is causing a bit of concern about how we measure it, but those are the main things to be aware of. These is what we mean by relevant high-rise buildings. Pretty simple when you're looking at new builds, but a little bit more complicated when you're looking at existing buildings and trying to determine whether or not your building falls under the high-rise building requirements or regime. Okay, so this is very relevant. These are the relevant buildings. So once you know that if you're dealing with those kinds of schemes, then you're having to go to the Building Safety Regulator because they are the building control body overall. There is some further definition in one of the requirements which talks about for during the occupation phase, which is equally applicable to the works which are going to be actually constructed. It talks about any story which is a rooftop machinery plant area or consists of exclusively of rooftop plant is excluded, and it's very clear, it says ignored. And any story consisting of a gallery with an internal floor area which is less than 50% is also excluded. Okay, so we need to be very careful when we measure these type of buildings. There is a whole raft in the regulations about some examples. Here's one. This is how you would do it simplistically. Start at the bottom, and it goes up to 6 stories. If that's more than 18 meters, then you are into the high-rise building definition. Okay, but it only applies to student accommodation, flats, hospitals, and care homes is the other one. Okay, if you're in that group, then fine. If it's an office block, it is a high rise, but it's not a high rise building that is of concern to the HSE in terms of the Building Safety Regulator regime. Okay, so there's a complete difference in that. And we're not talking anything technical here, like 2 staircases or anything. We're just looking at the simple process today. And all this week is all about process, unfortunately, to get you through these tighter regimes. So that's how we measure it. If you're over that height, you are into the building safety regime. Here's some more examples. So examples of a residential unit are a flat. Yeah, we would get that. Home of multiple occupation, shared accommodation with university halls. Residential unit can be found with any type of building, so it's not limited to tenure. And definition of service departments often trying to be muted as being part of hotels do not fall within the meaning of hotel for this regulation. So if you've got service departments, they are considered as flats. Okay, and then if they meet the story or height requirements over 18 meters, then at that point they are then part of the high-rise regime. Okay, so what does it mean for the transitional arrangements? Because we all know we work in this world of government interference. So the requirements are very simple, and in fact the government have listened to the industry moans and groans about making it reasonably simple and not constraining developers. I think they don't particularly understand the process of development in that much detail, but they've listened and they've now reneged on a couple of issues. So we need to make sure we get a building regulation application is served before the 1st of October 2023, which is only a couple of weeks away. All right, so for approved inspectors, we need to make sure we get NIN served. And obviously, if you're going to employ us, you need to get a statement of us to say, yes, we are going to get registered and we will employ registered building inspectors. Okay, that's a prerequisite. We've already made that statement that we are on a number of tenders, that's exactly what we're doing. So the application needs to be in. It needs to be in at least a week before the 1st of October because it has to be accepted. So you need to be very careful when you serve the notifications to the councils. It's is a legal process that we make sure the description of the work is full, making sure you get the number of units, the number of blocks, etc., etc. Okay, so that's very key because if we're going back afterwards to add more units in, then that potentially you are then making that additional requirement to the Building Safety Regulator if you don't then conform with the next pieces, which is the commencement. And this is where the government were intent on preventing what their terminology is gaming the system. So they wanted to make sure it was quite a stringent process, making sure people had the intent to complete buildings and not just leave them with a hole in the ground for forever and a day. So they've uplifted it slightly. It is now the 6th of April when you have to make this commencement. And effectively, it is just only a start pouring a trench foundation, for instance. And I've got a couple of slides which I'll come on to later. But effectively, you need to make your application before the 1st of October. And then you need to make a pile in the ground and pour some concrete in the trench or raft foundation before the 6th of April. And those are the requirements. Now, I know people will ask me, well, who checks that? There is no answer to that because we've not had anything from the HSE as yet. But we will need to make sure that once, because it's under the current requirements, I think we are duty bound from a building control perspective just to record the fact that we've made a substantial commencement and that we've made sure that we've given a letter to the client to say that the regulation has been adhered to, the transitional arrangements have been adhered to, and the fact that the IM was served and we've made a start, just for clarity. So I think that would be wise, project managers and clients, to make sure that actually happens. If you do that and you can then continue under the current building control regime, which I think for a lot of people using the approved inspectors and indeed some local authorities, they would deem that as being a perhaps a more preferable route, less bureaucratic, I suppose, and it'll allow the process that they've been used to continue. At the end of the project, the developer must, though, apply for registration with the HSE. And then the baton is passed to the owner of the building. Yeah? And all you do at that point is make sure you tell the HSE that it's now you're going to have to do a registration. And at that point, you need to give them a copy of the building control completion certificate. And then the HSE, under the registration process, will ask for a whole heap of further details, which is what they currently do when they are going through the registration of existing buildings. And for those of you who have been in that process will know there's quite a lot of detailed information that is expected to be provided, type of materials you're using, the golden thread aspects. Obviously for existing buildings, that's not easy to get, but there's an expectation of that level of detail when you come to the end. Okay, even for projects which are going forward at this point in time. And then when we get to that point, the HSC will consider the building as an existing building, and then we'll put it into the pile that they're dealing with over the next 2 or 3 years, I suspect, of their buildings, the 12,000 existing buildings that fall under their jurisdiction. So that's how that will pan out. So let's be very clear. The requirements are the initial notice must be served and not rejected. Now, a little quirk for the local authorities is that they have what they call a full plans submission. If you have a full plan submission that's rejected, then that is not allowable. And if it's been rejected, then it must be, you must then go to the Building Safety Regulator unless you manage to provide enough information for the local government to say it's been accepted and not rejected. Okay, so local authorities have a little bit more of an issue to deal with because they can't, or the developers can't have a rejected application. If they reject it and they fall after the 1st of October, then they'll be going to the Building Safety Regulator. For approved inspectors, that's not a requirement. It's only a requirement to make sure the notice is in and has been accepted by the local government. And there are only certain aspects that the local authority can object. One is, for instance, that you've got the details incorrect or you've got no drainage or whatever. Those are the minor details. And we would expect that your approved inspector, such as ourselves, would guide you through that to make sure we don't get any issues with rejections. Hence, they're allowed 5 working days. So in essence, you need to get a notice in served by the 22nd of September and then for not to be rejected. So we can't leave it afterwards to say, oh, by the way, in the 2nd of October, it was rejected. The 5 days is enshrined in the regulations. So 22nd of September is the key date. Get the notices in before then, which gives you the opportunity, even if you're not sure about when you're going to complete the work or start the work, then at least you have that opportunity. If you come after the 1st of October, there is no question you are going to the BSR if your building is a high-rise residential building or student accommodation or a hospital. Okay, so let's be very clear on that date. That cut-off date is succinct. And I've heard people say that potentially there'll be slippage. No, there'll be no slippage according to the HSC. They're saying the 1st of October is the deadline. That's what it is. And second point there, the trigger point is the HRB work must be sufficiently progressed within 6 months of the new regime coming into force. So it must be progressed by the 6th of April, 2024. Okay, so those are the key takeaway points. What does sufficiently progressed mean? And I know there's a whole raft of what does start, what does commencement mean, and it is more complicated than it has been. And there's some reasons for that. One is to prevent the lapsing of notices after 3 years. And one is to make sure that we don't get entangled with that and make sure we get buildings that are built to the latest standards rather than that. And also to safeguard against somebody putting a big plot of land with many, many houses and blocks on it and then doing one flat or one house, and that counts to register the whole scheme. That is not the case. So sufficiently progressed for new buildings means pouring of concrete for trench pads or raft foundations and permanent placing of piling. And I stress permanent. So, it's not the contig wall where you take it out afterwards. It has to be permanent placing of piling. For existing buildings, then it talks about the work starting as being just a start. And that's the same for material change of use and of anything like that. That it's just a work has started. So if you take a typical reclad, then in my opinion, a reclad isn't stripping off the cladding. That's not a start. The start is actually putting some cladding back. Or if you've got a refurbishment, then it is putting back a partition or a service that's in that building. It's not stripping out. It's not demolition. Yeah, it's not putting the scaffolding up, not putting the site offices up. It is actually a start. Okay, so you're putting something back. And then, as I advised, I think it'd be wise to get that inspected, make sure it's all documented so that if anyone comes calling, like the HSE, you can say, actually, there's the detail. Now, I don't know, there's no mechanism at the moment for anyone to tell anybody that, but maybe I don't know whether that will come in time, but I guess the HSE will be pretty busy anyway. So it'll be up to the professional of the people involved, the professionalism of the people involved. Bearing in mind that for those who are in building control, it is part of your honesty and integrity to make sure this happens. And if it doesn't, then you are duty bound to tell the HSE that actually this project hasn't started and actually the transitional arrangements haven't been adhered to. Therefore, Mr. Client, you're going to have to go and seek the gateway process with your client. Okay, so that's why we're having this registration process to make sure that we up the ante, we make sure that everybody understands the requirements. And I know that schemes slip, funding slips, and there is no leeway in this. The government have already backed down. They were talking about being up to DPC levels and all kinds of stuff. And that is coming, but that's not coming for this particular transitional arrangement. It also applies in each individual building. So if you get a lot of buildings on a site, which are a lot of blocks, then you must do it for each individual building. And just a note there, it only applies in England. It doesn't apply in Wales as yet. And Scotland have different laws and are seeking a different strategy, I think, in terms of this overall process. And indeed, just lots of the Scottish strategy we are seeing in the overall approach to building control from the English version. Okay, so we've understood what the building control has to be registered. We understood what the transitional parts, the key milestones are, and where it applies. So that means if after the 1st of October you want to make your application, then you're going to have to go down and speak to the HSE and go through their gateway process. Okay, so the safety regulator will be in play by the 1st of October. And they've got a distinct process, which we're going to cover off in more detail tomorrow. And it is a full session tomorrow. So the gateway submission, though, is not just providing all your building control requirements. It is a competency statement. It is a building regulation compliance statement and evidence. So how you've got there, your fire and emergency file and what it looks like at Gateway 2. Construction control plan, how you're going to control the design and the construction and making sure the construction feeds into the what was approved at the Gateway 2 stage. Understanding the change control process and making sure you log it properly. Having a mandatory occurrence reporting plan so people can say that if they found something which is incorrect, they can report it and it can be rectified without any recrimination. And then we need to think about a partial completion strategy, which is going to get even tougher than we currently have at the moment. And that's the implications we see from the guidance that the HSE have already released. But safe to say, if you have an opportunity to use the transition arrangements, my personal opinion, you should use it and grab it with all gusto, because this will become quite bureaucratic. And it will need a lot of time and effort to get through this gateway submission. So what happens then? if building control doesn't want to transfer to be an RBCA? Well, there is a requirement. It either reverts back to the Building Safety Regulator, or you apply and you register with another approved inspector. But you need to do that prior to the 1st of October. So if you get someone who decides we don't want to do this work anymore, perhaps they've decided to retire, then you need to be making sure that that project is transferred to another approved inspector, who then becomes an registered inspector prior to the 1st of October. And that or the alternative, is that you go to local authority, I suppose, or you could go and say, well, okay, fine, we'll just go to see the Building Safety Regulator. But at that point, you are making a Gateway 2 application. So I would urge you to think very carefully about the transfer process prior to the October deadline for those approved inspectors who are not going to continue with that kind of work. I don't know if there are any, but I'm sure there'll be one or two thinking perhaps we'll retire. Okay, so if you don't achieve the registration, your work has to go to the Building Safety Regulator. If you don't achieve the final on work or sufficiently progressed on work, then you'll also be going to see the Building Safety Regulator and making an application under the Gateway process. Okay, so at the end of the project, we get to this point where we are having to submit to the HSE, and we submit on registration the principal accountable person, that's the person who's running the project, will be required to provide a certificate issued under the existing building control regime before the building is registered. So you get your final certificate from an approved inspector or local authority, and you would then make your registration to the HSE under the existing building control provision. And then it then becomes an existing building, and the registration aspect of all the detailing will then come out, okay? And you'll be expected to provide that as an ongoing issue. So transferring to the BSR, person carried out the work should then notify the HSE, okay, of what the plans were, and if the plans were approved. The Building Safety Regulator said they won't reassess carte blanche the scheme, but it will review what the documentation, and it might ask for some more information depending on what their stance is on various aspects. Yeah. And the government expects the local authorities and approved inspectors to inform the regulator when the work has not started. So it is duty bound on us, as I said earlier on, to make sure that if you've not got your registration in, or you've not got your transitional sufficiently progressed stance, then we have to hand up, sorry, Mr. Regulator, sorry, Mr. Client, unfortunately, you can't use the transitional arrangements. You then must go back to the BSR and make a Gateway 2 application. Now, the Gateway 2 application will be minimum of 12 weeks for them to assess it. They'll do an initial assessment to make sure they've got all the bits of paper they need, and then they'll do a 12-week assessment. There may be, for existing buildings that don't meet the standard of the sufficiently progressed, a 10-day stand down. You started on site, but you haven't done much. It might be a 10-day stand down, depending on what the HSE think, whilst you're stuck there waiting for them to determine whether you can carry on with the frame or the drainage or whatever. Okay, it'll be a criminal offence if you continue and don't adhere to the system. Okay, and that's the way the process is. Effectively, you must make your building regulator application to the Building Safety Regulator if you don't adhere to the transitional arrangements. Now, I'm sure most people won't get to that point, but there are issues I'm not intending to go through those because enforcement will be by the Building Safety Regulator and not through approved inspectors or the new term RBCAs. So, in summary, then, we need to adhere to the arrangements, making sure that my process is that we don't get involved in the bureaucracy of the Gateway 2. Doesn't mean to say it's not safe, though. It's our role as inspectors to make sure that buildings are safe. My suggestion is that we adopt a shadow process, because you'll need a lot of the information when you get to the end of the scheme, when you've registered the scheme. So when the developer says, hey, Mr. HSC, here's my building control certificate, and then the HSC say, well, actually, this is all the information we need. So if you haven't got that to hand, then that makes it more difficult. So why don't we collect it and collate it whilst we're going through the scheme as a shadow? Yeah, it's what we would do under the new safety regime. So let's do it, and that's my my sort of concept, really, and my advice to clients. I think that developers, contractors, and design teams will require quite substantial guidance to make sure their schemes are fully compliant, and we'll go through that on how we get through the Gateway 2. You'll need it much earlier, and you need it quite stringently applied, because what you don't want to do, and as the HSC have reminded everybody, it's all about the quality of the submission, because otherwise that quality of the submission will mean more delay, and you don't want to delay schemes because you haven't provided various bits of the design. Okay, understand there is always the subcontractor designs further on, but that's what the change control and the construction control plan will cover off. But your basic designs should all be in place. And we need to make sure that we retain that information so we can move forward at the end of the scheme. So that's about, almost in theory, looking at the golden thread. I know people are already aware of the golden thread aspect, and that golden thread will be a potential lifeline for the people at the end of the scheme, the developers, when they're doing their registration process. A completion stage, again, the developer contractor passes all what we know as the Regulation 38 information. This is all the fire safety plans, the fire alarm layouts, all the fire safety reports, which should be stage 5 RIBA. Okay, to the owner to enable, firstly, for a fire risk assessment to be undertaken. Okay, so that's what they should be doing, and at that point, that's when the HSC will give you a will accept the registration with your building control certificate. It's vital information, all that golden thread Regulation 38 information, for the owner to present to this when he does his safety case, when he's done so by, or requested to do so by, the BSR. So you do the registration, a whole deal of that information will be required at that point. You know, what type of construction is it, what the height is, how many flats you've got, what your fire alarm evacuation strategy, etc. All those kind of detailed information will be expected, and we are expecting the HSC to provide even more guidance on what is required at the registration process stage, including structural analysis, etc., etc. So that is vital information that will be needed to register your scheme. Under the new schemes, then you won't be able to occupy the building until you get this registration process in. But for transitional schemes, that's not the case. This is why I think it's very key that the developers understand that the existing building control process remains for those buildings that are under the transitional arrangement. Okay, so there's no stopping of occupation at that point, yeah? But you have to make sure you register the scheme, and at that point you need a building control certificate. Then it becomes an existing building, and the HSC will deal with that during the registration, and indeed if they think it's a problem, they'll obviously interact at that point. So the level, as I say, of information under the change control, all that is the same as under BSR, but it's in a shadow format. Okay, so the HSE have made it very clear they are not involved in the process directly during the construction process if your transition arrangements are followed. Okay, and then the aspect of registration and safety case reviews will be in play at the completion stage. Okay, but I would expect most high-rise buildings that we won't that are just being completed, unless they're specific design issues, then I don't suspect that they will get targeted under the risk regime. There are probably much higher demands from existing buildings built some years ago that would be on their minds. And I think the quote that HSE said they've got 5 years worth of work to deal with the existing buildings that they've got, which is somewhere in the 12,000 mark. So just need to be aware of that. And that's how the transitional arrangements work. So there are some very key changes to building control. You are now having to think about the building control system as being registered. You need to choose the registered building control bodies. So it's either building control approved inspectors who now become the RBCAs. Okay, that's the name change, I suppose, if you're an approved inspector company. And then each of those companies need to employ registered individual building inspectors. And that also is applicable to local authority. Okay, so our colleagues in local government also need to be individually assessed, okay, and be competent to deal with that type of work. And we talked about the classification of those types of work. So you as a client would need to ask those pertinent questions, even of the local government. Have you got someone who can cover off this type of building? Because it's, you know, it's an 8-story office block. Have you got a class 3 individual surveyor? If you haven't, then fine. You either got to go and get one and hire one to deal with the plan assessment, site inspection, and signing of notices, or they can't deal with it and you have to go elsewhere. That's the facts of how, as I understand it, how that works in process. Yeah. Transitional arrangements. Yep, we've talked through that. This is a very pertinent for projects at the moment, which are currently in construction or past that construction of sufficiently progressed. But the main key issue is to make sure we get all these projects registered prior to October 24. Sorry, October 23. I wish it was 24. October 23. And we've been chasing around clients who have had projects which are unfortunately mothballed for some time, mostly due to the economic situation and indeed the COVID process. And we are uncovering projects which might get going by the next year, depending on how projects move forward and the funding moves forward. So it's important to make sure you get that registration in. If you don't get that registration in, you are definitely going to the Building Safety Regulator, and with all the bureaucracy that can encounter. Maybe it'll be smooth, I don't know, but I suspect with all things that are new, it'll take a time for it to be bedded in. And of course, bedded in often means delay, and developers don't want that delay because they've got flats they want to sell. And if you haven't got a certificate or assurance certificate from the regulator at the end of the project, when you're talking about under the gateway process, then you won't be able to occupy. Whereas the transitional arrangements allow you to continue with that aspect. As I say, webinar 2 explores the process of gateway submissions, and it's a full-on seminar, so we'll use probably all the allotted time. And gateway 3 outlines the process for the updates outside the higher risk regime. Okay, again, a bit more bureaucracy, unfortunately, but everyone needs to understand their duty and what they need to do. Okay, I think, Steve, that's me done. I would have said clearer guidance, safer buildings, but it's certainly going to be safer buildings. But I'm not sure the guidance is all there yet. We are still waiting for numerous parts of the government and indeed HSC to give us some clearer guidance. But yeah, that's the process as I see it. Steve.
Brilliant, thanks, Lee. So got loads of questions have come in, so I know that we're not going to get time to go through them all, but we'll have a go, see how many we can get through. So first one, can you confirm if there's a requirement for plans to be approved under the transitional arrangements? So we know that under the gateway process, you have to get sign off before you can proceed to gateway 3, but in terms of under the transitional arrangements?
No, there isn't. The government deliberately didn't steer that. What they said was you must get the notice, your initial notice, your registration in prior to October. The only slight hiccup is that if you do a full plans application to the council and they reject it, and they would normally only reject it because either something's very wrong or you haven't given them enough information, and they give you a rejection, which is normally either 5 or 8 week period, depending if you agree to the extension. If you get a rejection, then that means it's not registered. So in terms of the local authority, they would need to deal with that. And if it get rejected, then if you're past the 1st of October, then you're having to make an application to the BSR. So if you've got that currently on your scheme, you need to get that rectified so the local government officers can give you a conditional approval of some description and not a definitive rejection. So we don't require that to be done under the transition arrangement. Now it will change for other types of buildings, but we'll come on to that on the Thursday session.
So will all approved inspectors move over to the registered building control approvers, or is it just those that are going to be involved in HRBs?
No, all inspectors are expected to transfer over, although it depends if you don't want to do it anymore. And we have heard some people say, well, they're not doing this because it's too complicated or I don't want to get transferred over. But I would urge everybody to use your experience and be part of this change. Most building inspectors have got massive amount of experience to share, and we need as many inspectors as we can. There is not enough inspectors around in any event, so we need as many as we can. But I do hear rumours of some people saying they're not wanting to do it because they're old and bold like me, Steve. But just to tell you, just to let you know, Bureau Veritas are absolutely going to be a registered building control authority, and we will have all our staff being a registered building inspector.
Yeah. A few interesting ones coming up now, all to do with height. So this one's even more interesting because it has been challenged by a local fire authority. If you have a building that's 5 stories above ground, but 2 levels of basement below, would that be considered exceeding the 7 stories?
No, I don't think that does, because you measure it from the ground level up. Yeah. So yeah, that's how that works. I know that the technical requirements sometimes differ, but you can see from that slide that I showed earlier on how to measure it. It is in the regulation. There is a specific region with a lot of nice little diagrams, to be fair, that show you how you deal with the height issue. I mean, I've got one at the moment where we've got mezzanine floors going in, and people cutting down half the floor so it doesn't count as a story, so they can use the transitional arrangements to avoid the bureaucracy. So that's how difficult it becomes.
We'll have lots of developers going down rather than up.
Probably. Yeah.
Again, this is another one in relation to height. If a mixed-use building has residential below the 18 metres threshold and the office space above, does it qualify under the BSR referable scheme?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. We've debated this one quite a lot. I think, well, we've got one at the moment which is very similar. The answer is the building itself has residential units in it, therefore The building itself is over the limit, height limit, then it is a relevant building. Although you can look at compartmentation or sectional compartmentation. For instance, if you get a retail store, Tesco, Sainsbury's, all that kind of stuff, often at ground level, and you build on top of it with a block of flats, it doesn't mean that the fit out of the retail unit comes under the BSR, as long as there's no connection. So if you have staircases that connect to a lower floor and a podium or whatever, and then that has retail units, then that certainly would. But a Tesco, which is, or Sainsbury's or something, which would be out completely compartmented off, then that particular part, because otherwise the regulator is going to be inundated for minor issues, and we will talk through that in tomorrow's session, because it is a very interesting ground. And whilst we've got 10 or 11 figures in that document, then they don't cover those minutiae issues.
Can you clarify whether you can select your RBCA or whether one is allocated by the BSR HSE on HRBs?
So Dame Judith Hackett was very vigorous in this issue. She doesn't want developers to be choosing who their regulator is. So first point is, if you've got a high-rise building, then your regulator is the BSR, and they will then allocate a local authority or an approved inspector stroke RBCA from their framework. If you're outside of the high-rise regime, then you can choose who your regulator is, yeah? And that's the same as it is now. You need to make sure they are the right people for the right job. So you need to be making sure they understand, or they give you the, yes, we've got class 3 surveyors if it's a complicated building, or it's a class 2, or it's a residential, whatever, yeah? So you need to make sure that their competency matches up with what you are constructing.
So on that, and I spoke for the benefit of the audience, if you've got a high-rise residential, and there's been lots of discussions that I've certainly been having with developers, they will get allocated their building control body to look after their scheme. And certainly the calls that we've had with the Building Safety Regulator, who've been presenting a lot to developers, are saying you'll need to go out and get a building control advisor. So we'll have our statutory building control service, but we'll also have a building control assurance advisory service. So if we weren't appointed by the HSE or the BSR to provide that, if we were on that panel, we'd still be able to provide the consultancy services.
Yeah, it's very clear from the CIC and indeed from Dame Judith Hackett that they and the government that they see building control in a different light than that has occurred in the last 10 to 15 years for sure, where we've approved inspectors have become more helpful, I suppose, and indeed more of a consultancy than a regulator. The government see that as being the wrong remit, that you are now going to speak to a regulator and the regulator says, yes, it complies, or no, it doesn't comply. Yeah. So if you're dealing with the regulator, the BSR, and they appoint under the multidisciplinary team an inspector, whether it's local authority or whether it's building control from an AI, then the expectation is that you get that same level of service. You don't get a consultancy service. So they urge you to consider making sure you get a building control advisor onto the scheme, so you can guide them, which is what I suggested earlier on the slides, guide you to make sure your applications are made appropriately and cover the depth of detail that you need to make sure your submission goes through, hopefully first time within the 12 weeks, because you don't want to be there 15, 16 weeks still trying to design glazing manifestation or whatever it is. But just remember, this session today was all about getting through the transition arrangement for the existing buildings and making sure that we can get those up and built to a certain level, and then making sure that we progress on the existing stance. Again, we're more than able to help people out with getting through this little piece, although I suggest that most of our clients have already enacted most of this.
So we're now on 1:30. There's loads of questions, so we'll add those into the mix on Friday. We will answer them all, and any that we don't pick up on Friday, we'll send out a response. So thanks everybody for joining today. The session was recorded. A summary of all the questions. CPD certificates will be issued. Certificates and the recordings will be issued to those registered and in attendance. Because we can't pick up if you weren't in attendance or so ever. I hope you found it useful. If you've got any questions, then ping them over to Andy or myself on email or LinkedIn or whatever, and we'll pick those up on Friday's Q&A session if we can. And I think many of you are registered for tomorrow's session as well. So look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of the day and evening. See you tomorrow. Many thanks indeed. Cheers.
Thank you.